So we are going to continue. We were done with the data ingestion. Let's move to the next step, which entails data validation. Again, the first step is about our configurations. We need to set our configurations to ensure that everything is set. So the config.yaml. So just go to the config.yaml file. Then stage 2 will be about data validation. Let's define the data validation. The data validation, basically we are checking if our data is set. So the first thing is the root directory. So we won't be using the directory for data ingestion. So we'll create a new directory for data validation. Then so that will be the root directory. Then data directory for the data source. Data source will be from data ingestion. So that is again artifacts / data ingestion. And we need to specify the data itself. That's the web churn CSV. I think we're just going to use this. So artifacts data ingestion web churn CSV. Then we can have another file, let's say status file. So this will be a JSON file, and it will store metadata about our data validation. Okay, so that's it. Then the next thing that we need to do is to specify or give a list of the entire columns that we do have in our data. Okay, so this is the columns: age, gender, region, membership category, joined through referral, all the way login transaction ratio. So when we check if we have the correct names of the columns, then we need to this will be the critical columns. Basically specifies that the data that we have imported has the correct columns. So remember, when dealing with the data validation, we need to update our schema. So let's go to the schema. Under the schema, we need to update our schema. So I'll just do away with the key and value that the placeholders that we used previously, and then state the column. So these are the columns that our data. This is the columns or the variables in our data. So we are taking or are using a dictionary, the key and the value. So the key is actually the name of the column itself, the name of the attribute itself. Then now we are also specifying the type, the data type for the values in those attributes or in those columns. Okay. So for example, age, float, gender, object, region, category, object, membership, object meaning it's a string, float is a numeric value, integer is a numeric value. So after specifying that, we also need to specify the target column. So the target column is the churn risk score. Okay. So we have updated our schema, ensure that we have given the list of the columns in our data as well as the data type, and we also we have also named our target column. So our schema is okay, and also our config.yaml file where we have given the list of all columns, and again that is okay. So you can see that our configuration files, we have populated those files with the necessary information. So then we move to our trial, and we write the code for data validation, execute, and see if it will be running okay. So the first thing, as usual, will be about importing the necessary libraries. So data class, pathlib, then the constants, config.yaml, the params. Then now we don't using the params, but the schema will be important. Then we also import these functions from utils. These reusable functions will be reading files from the YAML files, and also will be creating directories. So these functions will be necessary. and also this importing component, this no. Also files like import OS, JSON, the logging, pandas, all that. So again, we start with our, this will be a data validation entity. So this is the configuration entity. For that, again, we are going to use a data class. So it's a data class. And now we specify data class. So the class will be data validation config. So data validation config. The data validation config, what we just need to do, go back to our config.yaml. We need to state all this. So go back, then can just paste it here. And state that this is a path. A data source, we can call the data source. This one, we can use a string, can use a path, use a status. Even this, I think this is just a path, if I'm not wrong. Let's see if we are critical columns. This one can call this as a list. Then we also need to add data source. That's okay. Status file. That's okay. All schema. Dictionary. This one is a list. This one is a dictionary path. Okay. So after this, we need to create the configuration manager. Configuration manager. We'll just create that configuration manager. I think class configuration manager, self config file, path schema. I think everything is okay. So essentially, with the configuration manager, we are initializing it with 3 file paths. That is the config file path, params file path, and the schema file path. These paths will be leading us to different YAML configuration files that contains various parameters and schemas required for the data validation process. Okay, so you can see that's it. Then now we can create these directories. So just to complete this segment, we need to add another method. So that is the get data validation config. So the get data validation config method of the configuration manager, this one here. So the get data validation config method of the configuration manager class is used to, essentially you're using this to create and return the data validation config, this one here. Objects which contains the configuration parameters that are required for the data validation. So what we have specified here. So there is something that we need to, the status file supposed to be this one. So supposed to be small caps, small letters. That's the status file. And this is supposed to be set of directory. You can say data source if I'm not wrong. Then directory status file supposed to be as file. So this will be a JSON file, the metadata under the data validation. This will be data source all schema. All schema, it will be the schema. Then critical columns, there are the critical columns. I think root directory, data file, data source, schema, and critical columns. So I think that's okay. Then after that, we need to start now the actual data validation process. The data validation component class. So this will handle the data validation, the actual data validation. So class data validation. The data validation self-config, data validation config. Then this one will just be self-config. And I don't need this. Then from here, we start create a method validate all columns. So we are going to validate first, get the method to validate all the columns. So validate all columns. So self then data. So with the data validation columns, let's write the code first. So with this one, again, we can say try, then validation status. Then this one we set to true. Then create a new variable that stores all the columns. So all columns. So here we give a list. It should be a list of data.columns. So the columns in our data. Then we have, remember, we have all this old schema. So this again will give us a list. So this list should be the one that we provided in the configuration file. So self.config schema. Then we should give this. It should be in form of keys. So I think that one is okay. After this, I will create a for loop for checking for the missing columns. So missing columns, so column for column in all schema, if column not in all columns. Then if we have extra columns, we can also specify that for the extra columns. It should notify us if we have extra columns. So extra columns, and say again column in all columns calls, that's okay. If call not in all schema, I think that one just create a separation from this. Then from here, you can now use the if statement. So if missing columns, or we have extra columns, and for this case, we need to our validation status will be should now, let's spin this to be false. It should now be false. Then from here, we will return. We need to return a validation status. Then encapsulate this in the excepts. So except as E, then just say erase E. Login error. Yeah, that one is okay. So essentially, what are we doing under this method? So this method starts by initializing the validation status. We are saying the validation status as true. This variable will be used to track the overall validation status when the overall validation status. So it will be retrieving the list of columns from the provided data, this one here, and lists of columns are from the schema, the ones that we have provided in our configuration files. Then it will calculate the missing columns using this. And by comparing the schema columns with the data columns, so we are comparing this one and this one here to check if we indeed have missing values. Similarly, it's also going to calculate extra columns. So this one here. So with the extra columns, again, we are comparing the data in the comparing the columns in our data as well as the ones that we have provided in the configuration file to check if again there is an error. I think we are having call for call in all. If call supposed to be not in all schema. Yeah, I think it's okay. Again, the same thing is happening with the extra columns. We are checking if our data has extra columns. So if either a missing column or extra column, this one here, are not empty, it means that the validation status has failed. And in this case, we are going to print false. Finally, the method returns the validation status. So if it is true, it indicates that all columns in the data match the schema, and if it is false, again it will indicate that there are missing or extra columns in our data. So that was the first method, which was all about validating all columns. So our next method will be validating the data types. So that will be the next method. So validate missing values. So again, now we can self data. That's okay. And I'm going to use the try block. So validation status again are going to be true. Then from here, I'll use the old schema and schema self.config all schema. I just do away with this. Okay, then type, if there is a type mismatch, so type mismatch, with the dictionary that type mismatch supposed to be self type mismatch. And I'll just use a for loop that will help us tackle that. So suppose type mismatches, so plural type mismatches, that's okay. I think it's okay. Again, with this method, it starts by initializing the validation status to be true, this one here, and retrieving the old schema from the data validation configuration object, old schema from the data validation config object, this one here. So from here, again, we create an empty dictionary type mismatches to store any columns that have data type mismatch. So yeah, that's obvious. Then a loop is used to iterate over each column. So this one, this for loop that we are using here, will be used to iterate over each column and its expected data type in the schema as we provided. So we are going to loop to check if the data in the schema and the data in the that we imported from the MongoDB have if there is a mismatch in the data type. And if the actual data type does not match the expected data type, then a tuple containing the expected and the actual data type is added to the type mismatch. This one here, type mismatch. Yeah, this one here, and the validation status will be set to false. So that's all about the missing values. Is it missing value? No, data type supposed to be all columns. This is supposed to be checking for the data types. Sorry, supposed to be data types. Okay, then now we use the exception to raise any exception that might occur during the execution of the method are caught using exception. Okay, so the last one will be the validate if we have missing values. So that will be the last method under the data validation. Of course, there are other types. For example, checking if the range of values or if the categorical attributes have the necessary, or if your target column has the the, the classes, the respective classes. So you expect if your target column has 2 classes, then you can also check for that during the data validation. You can check for the range of values in the different attributes. And you can also check if the values in the different categorical values match. Okay. So after we are done with that, we can set the if else block, not the if else block. This is the main block. So again, we start by initializing the configuration manager. Then we get the data validation config object. Then create the data validation object to the obtained configuration. And now we can fetch data from the CSV. Or you can alternatively directly import data from MongoDB, but I don't think this will be necessary. Then you can perform the data validation where we validate all the columns, we validate the data type, then we validate the missing values as described by the different methods that we are using. Then when we are done with that, we can create a dictionary with the validation status. This one here, then you can save the results in a JSON file. Okay, and I think that's it. So this will once again become our pipeline. Okay, so I'm going to execute this code, then to see. I'm going to execute this so that let's see if it will run successful. So again, Python .main.py. We can say data validation, copy relative path. So we run the data validation component. You can see we are getting an error. Data directory. So the data validation config has no attributes data directory. So data validation config data source. No, it's supposed to be data source, then schema config.yaml, data source, and then let's see. I know 123 supposed to be data source. Data source, I think. Okay, so let's run this again. So these errors are common. So sometimes I usually say that you need to, even though you are very careful, these errors are quite common, and you need to encounter those errors. Status file, this one here, you're not using, it's supposed to be status file. I think it's in small letters, not in caps. So again, status file, where is it? Yeah, this one here. status file. So we just save, continue. Let's see if you're going to get we should create. I think now it is successful. Data validation status successful. You can see we have in the artifacts folder, we have now the data validation, and inside the data validation we have the JSON file validation all columns true, validate all types true, validate missing values to be true. So I think that one is okay. So again, remember we need to separate our code into its constituents. So we start again with the data validation entity. So copy that, and now go to your SRC folder, SRC Churn entity, config entity, then just below the data ingestion, copy the data validation entity. That's okay. Then after this, we need to create the configuration manager. I think this one is a constant, so we just need to copy this. So go to our entity configuration. So this will be the next method, and this will be our data ingestion config. So this will be our data validation config manager. So we need to import this from the entity. So the best way we can just do, instead of just use the asterisk, import everything from the entity. So when we do that again, I think it's okay. Columns, yeah. So the next step after that entity config manager is the components. So data validation, just copy everything, then go to the components, data validation component. So just so data validation, Control A, Control C, data validation, Control V. Then this pipeline is not necessary. I'll just do away with it. Then I'll go to the config manager. We don't need the config manager. I can just do away with this again. Let's remain with the data validation component. So we need to import the data validation config. So you can say from src.churn entity config entity, going to import data validation config. So that's okay. We don't need this. I don't think we need this. We also don't need the JSON. Don't need the JSON. Let's see, what are we missing? No, don't think we are missing anything. That's okay. That's okay. Everything seems to be okay. That is the component. So we move to the pipeline. So pipeline, data validation pipeline. So in the pipeline, data validation. So we start by importing the libraries. Okay, then we create the name of the pipeline. Pipeline name. Pipeline, that's okay. Then we create a class, data validation pipeline class. Then we define the pipeline itself. So I'm just going to copy this one here. So starting from this one the way up to here. So just copy this, go to the pipeline, then define self You can just paste everything here. So where we start by initializing the configuration manager, get the validation config, create the data validation object with the obtained configuration, then fetch data for the CSV, perform data validation in the columns, perform data validation for all columns, data type, all if you have columns, data type, and the missing values, then store the results in a JSON file. Then if overall, that's okay. I'll just end this something like this. So that one is okay. Then we go to our main.yaml. Then we can just main.yaml, main.py, main.py. Now we create another component name, a data validation component, and then we import the pipeline for that. So from src.churn dot supposed to be pipelines dot pip pipeline number 2 data validation, import data validation pipeline, data validation, nope, supposed to be data validation pipeline, not this one, data validation pipeline. Yep, that's it. So for me, I can just go to my dvc.yaml, then the dvc.yaml, and just state again, create the stage number 2. Stage number 2 is the data validation. The command is this one here. Then the dependencies, this one, the config.yaml, and also this one is also a dependency, web churn CSV. Then from here we can do the output. From here is the status.json file. I think status.json, yeah. So instead of running main.py, you can just execute. Let's ensure we have saved everything. So this one is correct. Config.yaml, save, schema.main.py, and save it. This one and save. We can just do a dvc log. Don't need it. dvc.yaml. Sure you have saved it. So from the terminal, you can just run the command dvc repro. So when you run the dvc repro, wait and see the magic with the dvc. Remember, we have not made any changes in our data ingestion component, so it's not going to execute that component, so it will be skipping that component. So just wait and see the magic. Pipelines. You can see collecting files. You can see that running stage data ingestion. So we don't expect it to, just expect it to skip the data ingestion component. Oops, I don't know, running stage, don't know why, yeah? But we should be skipping the data ingestion component. Data ingestion pipeline, or what are we missing? Data validation churn pipeline. Anyway, data ingestion terminated successfully. Updating the log file dvc.log, and from here we need to again start the data validation. Don't know why it's supposed, because we have already run this phase, we're just supposed to skip. or we can just run these to auto stage. We have some problem. Anyway, I'll see into it. Then in the next video, when we do the data transformation, I will inform you why we are having that challenge. So let's do it. Push this to Git repository. So git add git status. Git commit -m data validation complete. And now we can push. So git push -u origin to main. Then we can call it a day. So we are able to chain those two together, the data validation and the data ingestion. So we are able to ingest data into the model, and after that we are able to validate the data based on the instructions that we detailed. You can now see this is we call it the DAG for data ingestion. You can see the data validation. The data validation phase. This is the DAG from the dvc.yaml. So that's it for today. So I'll see you in the next one when we start the data transformation phase. Once again, I'm very grateful for your time. Very grateful for you to take time to watch these videos. So I'll just humbly request that you subscribe to the channel. Like this video on your way out. Share it with friends and colleagues. Okay. So until next time, see you.